Good afternoon. That is indeed a tough talk to follow. All right. I'm at Capsulate. It's a small startup. You haven't heard of it, but this is our slide for the front of a thing. To give you a little bit of an intro, so my name is Brandon Edwards. I have a background mostly in reverse engineering and exploit development, pen testing. I used a lot of millennial glyphs here, as I like to call them, which is to say I like hacking computers. So I'm going to be trying to give my perspective on the premise of the talk, which is resilience. And I guess for that we should probably start at the premise, which is hacking is inevitable. You can't stop hackers, and with enough resources, enough time, a hacker will win. Users will click links, malicious links. They will willingly forfeit their credentials. They will run attachments. They will gladly click through all of the security dialogues, which try to warn them not to do these things. Presented on the screen is an example of how we've sort of gotten user conditioning to be an element of attack, where we say, in order to render this document with your old version of Word, you must click Enable Content. And users gladly will click Enable Content, which literally means run a program in this document. We know that users will click links. We know there will be more vulnerabilities. As a reverse engineer and vulnerability discoverer, I love finding bugs. I can tell you that there's an infinite sea of bugs. It's funny how the world seems fascinated, or at least media seems fascinated with today's 0 day. But the thing about 0 day is you can't measure how long it's been known or how many there are. It's infinite, it's vast. There will be more bugs. There will be bugs in SSL. There will be bugs in your OS. There will be bugs in the libraries you use, in the firmware that runs your chip. We have Intel embedding web servers in the PCH components of the chip. We have IoT devices. I'm pretty sure these electronic power management systems are networked. We have software, and where there's software, there are bugs. We know this. So there will be more bugs. There will be more attacks. There will be more ransomware as a result of it. As you can see here, I have a screenshot of the WannaCry, which I'm sure has been a hot topic I know has been discussed multiple times today. So I think it's important to think not about how do we prevent bugs, but how do we behave with resiliency? How do we exhibit resiliency? And what is resiliency? I would posit that it's the ability to respond and recover from attack without permanent damage. And that does not necessarily just mean identifying the attack up front. This is all elements of the attack. This is how are you resilient to the attacker? How are you resilient to reconnaissance? How are you resilient to exploitation, exfiltration? What does resiliency mean? And how can we achieve that? So I'll be discussing that, and I think a lot of it has to do with, one, accepting attack is present, and two, leveraging a symmetry or trying to create a symmetry in your advantage so that you can respond accordingly. So, like I said, this is not, I think a lot of people focus on resiliency as sort of a, we saw that an attack happened, we formatted the system, and we're back online. But you want to be resilient at all phases. You want to be, and this plays into the asymmetry. You want to be at every opportunity trying to be able to recover and or resistant to attack, and thus resilient when you do spot something. The attacker is still, even though they have some sort of gain, they are still trying to work with it. They have not immediately won everything. So I want to start with a primitive example of resilience. And by primitive, I just mean that it already exists and it's well understood. I don't by any means want to discredit this mechanism, but multi-factor authentication. It's something we all know, it exists. Now you log into your bank from a new computer or from a new location. You buy a new phone and you need to do something. The provider, your bank wants to verify you. They text you a special code. You key in that code. This is now something that's very common. The user is familiar with this workflow. What does this mean? How does this exhibit resiliency? Well, if you were phished, your password, you willingly gave up your password, or maybe you reused a password from a previously, from another system that was compromised. Passwords were dumped. Someone is trying to do lateral movement. They are applying your credentials from another location. Now they have to not only know your password, but devise a means by which they can either intercept your text, predict the code, or basically something that reeks of effort for the attacker. So why is this resiliency? Well, they successfully gained your credentials, but you are resilient to that. The service is exhibiting resiliency to attack in that it is not necessarily game over just because they have your creds. So if we want to take that one step further, the recent election in France was really interesting because, as the news has reported, there's been lots of election hacking. In the US, we are also apparently susceptible to this. The Macron, not sure how to pronounce it, campaign was phished heavily and attacked heavily, and their response was very interesting. Accepting that hacking is inevitable, the Macron campaign saw these emails come in with links to phishing pages, and then spammed the forms, the phishing forms, type in your password here for account security. Spammed that flooded it with misinformation, wrong accounts, wrong passwords, real accounts that were fake, with wrong passwords, with right passwords, with all sorts of stuff. So now the attackers would have to sift through and first determine, would these creds work? And then two, is this the real account of the user I was targeting or the users I was targeting? And so now you've shifted the game. You've changed, because you have the playing field, you've changed sort of the advantage. No longer do you have the ability to simply use these credentials. You don't have to vet the information you're getting, and thus the people behind the campaign were able to say immediately, this information is forged or incorrect because we planted it. We control the playing field, we control the game. So I'm actually here, by the way, on behalf of my co-founder Dino, who was looking forward to and unhappy they couldn't make it here. Looking forward to both speaking and a vacation here in Stockholm, which I'm enjoying on his behalf. But Dino has this quote, which is, if the value of your data exceeds the cost of attack, you will be hacked. I mean, it's logical, right? That's like hacker economics. It's like behavioral economics almost. It's if I can clearly define how much it'll take to hack you, and I will gain more than that, that's a worthy investment of my hacking efforts. So a lot of people tried to then take that theory or that concept and say, well, let's raise the cost of attack, which is an idea with which I completely agree. However, the other element of that is, how do you devalue the gains from an attack? So in the case of phishing, with Macron, for example, in that election, and again, I apologize for mispronouncing the name, but now, even if the attack succeeded, the gains from it were devalued because they have to spend so much more effort going through all the credentials. So how do you devalue the gains for an attacker in order to exhibit resiliency? One case of this, so in my background as a pen tester, I had some tooling where I would scan the target environment, and specifically the web pages of the company that was paying us to assess them, and we would collect all of the engrams, these short pieces of text phrases from the web page. And that's because, let's say you work at Bob's Garden. It's not unlikely that your password as a default user is welcome to Bob's Garden, or something around gardening, or a type of flower, or whatever the case may be. So how do you build a dictionary? You scan the site, and you collect all these engrams, and you construct special dictionaries for cracking these passwords. How can you apply this sort of defensively in the same way it was used in the Macron election? Plant invisible text on your website, same color as the background, with specific words that are not only not real passwords, but then you watch for on login. Perhaps you set up default user accounts with these passwords, and you know if someone logs in with that, or if an authentication attempt is made, that someone is trying to crack your passwords because they've harvested this data from your website, and now they're trying to attack you. This is leveraging automation in return to the automation the attacker is leveraging against you or is trying to use against you, and raises the cost of attack, because now the attacker has to vet the password list that they intended to automate. Their automation is no longer automation. If you have to manually go through every password that you are trying to generate, you might as well be manually typing in the passwords. Another example is planted accounts. And this is also from my friend from whom I'm stealing the vacation. Dino has this idea of planting these accounts where, like, for example, if you have a website and you have a database backing it, plant a user in there with a password, or perhaps a piece of information tied to a user, a fake credit card number with a prepaid card where you just monitor that account. No one should be using it. The second you see that used, that's a signal, high confidence, high fidelity signal that something has compromised the database or somewhere along the chain. And for an attacker, it's very difficult to counter or to verify. If their goal is credit card numbers, they collect the credit card numbers, even if they conduct a test charge to see if the credit card's real, which it will be if it's a prepaid card. Now they've got a problem because they've identified themselves. So, and by the way, a lot of this is not to give just literal examples, but to sort of spark the idea around how can you leverage your existing home field advantage to have resilience. In this case, you're resilient in that if you can spot the attack, you know that someone's there, you may have an eye on them before they know it, and you can respond and recover. So another element of resilience is a little more literal. In the modern infrastructure world of continuous CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, we have the concept of microservices commonly delivered by means of containers or VMs, and the whole doctrine of continuous deployment is meant to be so that you can always be ready to deploy. You're always ready to ship existing code. You've gone through testing. If something goes down, you can redeploy instantly. You have this high availability sort of granted to you because you have a network that is modular. It is separated. Pieces go down. You redeploy instantly, move to another cloud provider, whatever it may be, or scale out of your existing infrastructure into the cloud. And the interesting thing about that is that it's designed to be fault tolerant at scale. And that is because it is accepting that at scale, you're going to exhibit fault. Faults will happen. You'll have hardware failures, software failures. Every piece of software has bugs. You're going to have crashes. You're going to have unexpected spikes that cause weird conditions that only reproduce in production. And if you accept that, and sort of the way the industry has accepted that, is designing their networks around this and accepting that, well, we could try and debug it or make the code bug-free, but it's much easier to make it redeployable and thus easily replaceable, and thus resilient to faults while running. And so what's interesting about that is, oh, and by the way, so Netflix, for example, publishes code to test this. They have what they call Chaos Monkey, which is a service to introduce chaos into other services. It literally creates faults, kills other services, removes files, pulls the rug out sort of from under your infrastructure in order for you to test your resiliency to this. Intentionally, they run this in production in order to fault things so that they can see how quickly they swap in new components. They have a similar suite of services. They have a whole suite of services. So another one is Health Monkey, or Dr. Monkey, I believe. It does health checks like, are we exhibiting high CPU load? Do we have the right files in place, or whatever that health checks are deemed as? If not, then that instance should be removed and pulled out. They have also Security Monkey. Now this is where I'm sort of going with this thought or this idea. If we accept that at scale there will be faults, and we've already accepted that there will be hacking, then why not apply the same sort of methodology to your environment, where if you accept that a certain percentage of your systems will fault, a certain percentage of your systems will be hacked, why not have automation to swap things out as early as you can, which makes you resilient? If your infrastructure is already built such that pieces are modular, can be removed out from underneath and replaced immediately, you've now made the environment incredibly hostile to the attacker. They have a limited time with which, well, actually, let me back up. There's this other idea that's completely counterintuitive, exhibited in this sort of microservice world, which is reverse uptime. And the idea of reverse uptime is the opposite of uptime. The idea is you are not running, you want to have a maximum time window for which a given instance runs, a given container, a given VM, a given service. Let's say 12 hours. If your service runs beyond that, it needs to be killed, and probably before then. And this is sort of just a network hygiene way of thinking where bugs sort of manifest more over time. Faults can happen. We know if we start from a clean slate that we have a known environment with which we're working. And that just on its own, by just being hygienic service speaking, it is already a hostile environment for attackers. They have a limited time with which they can work with a compromise. They pop a web application, they pop any number of things, a server by means of some library, and now they've got 12 hours max with which to collect data, harvest credentials, or try and persist. By the way, persisting becomes incredibly difficult when you are the whole system is removed. They could infect a given web application file or a given library, but the whole container or VM is swapped out, and now what do they have? And so this by being fault resistant and fault resilient, they are now also attack resilient, which to me is an interesting concept. If you were to tie automation to detecting attacks, to responding in this way, even if you have false positives, if you accept that false positives fall into your tolerance for faults and your sort of acceptance of faults and your margin for faults, and then real attacks that are not false positives are real attacks, both of which you've accounted for now. You've got, well, I know things fail sometimes, so I swap them out. And I know things get attacked, so I swap them out. So now you've got this sort of mindset of immutability and ephemerality. And actually, in this sort of CI/CD world, this is thought of, there's a phrase for it, which is cattle, not pets. And that sort of approach is valuable for treating your systems. Don't hug your servers. Think of them as things you should be able to replace in order to be resilient, both for stability as well as for security. So one other thing I wanted to discuss was at a previous job, I built a inline email sort of scanning thing that took links and attachments and ran it in a custom sandbox. And it was intentionally custom so that attackers wouldn't have knowledge ahead of time of what to look for or how to determine that it was there. And there were a few interesting things around that. One was we watched entire attack campaigns drop just because the second they could detect that they didn't know what a system was by means of in-browser detection, or even when you would run their macro in the sandbox, they were very uncomfortable with it. They didn't want to, it was usually second stage sort of payloads. You'd run one thing, it would download a second thing. It would almost never download the second thing after they started to detect they were in an awkward environment that they didn't know, because they don't want to expose their secrets, they don't want to tip their hand. So why is that interesting? As a security measure, I started recommending to people that they install sysinternal's process monitor and the artifacts of VMware. And the reason why was both of these things were things that attackers would look for, because their presence would then create the they would create the image, the illusion rather, of being in a sandbox. So if you're playing this sort of cat and mouse game with the attackers and they're looking for sandboxes, look like a sandbox. Now you are resilient in that their reconnaissance efforts are flawed. They don't know if they should be throwing an attack or not. They do not know if when they land will they be able to persist. And also then I would say do run sandboxes and mimic those sandboxes in your environment, which then gives you both intelligence but also a sense of, and resilience is not really the right word as much as resistance towards attack, because the attacker is uncertain. You're removing determinism, or rather introducing false determinism into their analysis process. Don't do this at the cost of complexity. I'd like to echo Windows comments. So one interesting thing is that Microsoft has this tool, EMET, wonderful tool. I run it. I highly recommend that everyone runs it. It is one of the tools that introduces higher cost to the attacker. An exploit that would take them a week now takes 6 weeks. perhaps only once if they have a generic email bypass, but even then, you're raising the cost. The problem with that is manageability. Admins don't know how it works. They don't understand it. If it doesn't work with a certain program, they don't know why. The complexity of EMET, unfortunately, scares off its potential user base. It is probably the best counterattack tool out there, minus sort of macro virus style attacks. But as far as anti-exploitation, it is one of the best tools that I can think of, and it's free, and its deployment is in single-digit at best percentage numbers. This is because despite it granting asymmetry and making your applications resilient to exploitation, the complexity makes it too difficult for administrators to manage or understand. So I'd like to use that as sort of a case example on the other side of multi-factor obvious, works well, people understand it, EMET, voodoo black magic, no one quite gets it. There's a happy middle ground there. Or I'd rather move more towards the multi-factor side. What else did I want to tell you guys about? Yeah, I really think that's it. I would say be resilient in the reconnaissance phase, try and cloud data as much as possible. Be resilient in the exploitation phase, identify when someone has successfully exploited your users or is already on a system. Be resilient in the recovery stage, much like this sort of reverse uptime. Swap components out, make it hard to persist, make it easy for you to recover. Also, if you're operating on that model, it's easy to take something offline and analyze it. If you can freeze an instance, freeze a VM, freeze a container, analyze it offline while already replacing it with a new one. You don't have to leave it in place. Do not latch onto the idea of, again, hugging your servers or keeping them it's cattle, not pets. Think of your services as something there to serve you, not something that you are there to serve. And with that, you'll be resilient to attack. I don't know how much time I have, or if that is.
Well, you have more time if you want it.
So. Well, let's open up to questions if anyone has them.
Sure.
Not all at once, though.
Yeah. Well, he doesn't have any books, so you're gonna have to ask questions anyway. I know it's hard to work for free.
I'll drop an Ode if that.
We have a question in the back there, so wait for the mic and you can ask your question.
Oh, EMET. Exploit mitigation extension toolkit or something? I would think Windows could correct. Oh, well,
it's a Microsoft
tool. It's it's a great tool. I really do recommend it. It does grant again asymmetry in the hands of the defender, but it requires some technical know-how to understand which options to select, and thus when things crash, users don't know how to handle it. And
cool. You got a question? Anyone else? Here's a guy who's been like a reverse engineer, pen tester, does all these kind of cool things. Now he's talking about these new ways of defending yourself. And you don't have any questions. You know this already, right? Is that it?
I can elaborate on where attacks will go if that's interesting.
Sure.
So being that I've just told you that do we have time?
Of course, for you, man.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you.
Hey, take it.
So now that we've talked about sort of this element of resilience by means of ephemerality, swapping things out, we will see attacks targeting things like the Kubernetes management system, the sort of fabric, the Docker management system, the orchestration layers of the network. So with your resilience, when you consider things like what are the counter exploitation, what are the pieces that are going to be more difficult to swap out? Where do I need to be more resilient in actually running because I can't have that same ephemerality? You want to be thinking about the orchestration layer, the fabric that literally runs your network, the things that manage your service discovery, the things that manage your service deployment, your code management tools, your Git repos, your Jenkins, all of your automated testing, things like BuildKite, all of these things where they're literally picking up code from one source, move it to another, compiling it and running it. That's obviously a very appealing target for an attacker. And so moving forward with next generation resilience, that is where attackers will be going because they'll know if they just pop your web application or just pop your existing services, that those are going to be cycled out very quickly. Now you want to be keeping an eye on the things that are not cycled out quickly and that also sort of hold the keys to the rest of the network infrastructure. So yeah, that's it. Those are my thoughts on that.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Brandon.